Greetings and shalom, all of you who are watching VFI News and anyone else that's receiving our email version of the VFI News. You can sign up for it at visionforisrael.com. Now, it's been another eventful week in Israel, but the story everyone is following this past week isn't about what's happening here, but rather what's happening half a world away in Sydney, Australia. The shocking mass attack on a Hanukkah party on Bondi Beach, resulting in multiple fatalities and injuries, has reverberated here in Israel and raised many more questions. Meanwhile, we've got some answers to questions we had about what's going to be in the upcoming Israeli state budget, and there's no point in hiding the fact that it's some very sobering news. There is also a growing sense that progress in the ceasefire plan for Gaza is stuck, and there is also a sense that a renewed conflict with Hezbollah and Lebanon is all but inevitable in the not-so-distant future. But we're also in the midst and towards the end of Hanukkah, and that's a season with lots of joy and fun. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Friends, we'll start this week's report with the ongoing fallout from Sunday's mass terror attack in Sydney, Australia. As has been widely reported, this attack took place as hundreds of Sydney's Jewish community gathered for Hanukkah on the beach to mark the first evening of the traditional holiday in a rather untraditional way. The party took place 2,000 people, they say, hosted by Sydney chapter of the Chabad organization at Bondi Beach, and had been well underway for almost 2 hours when a car pulled up, two men got out, moved to an elevated position on a nearby bridge, and opened up fire. The shooters were later identified as Sajid Akram, 50 years old, and his son Nabid Akram, 24. It took the police several minutes to respond to their rampage, and the attackers were able to fire at least 50 shots from the hunting rifles they brought with them, resulting in 15 fatalities with dozens of other people wounded, some say up to 40 of them, including 2 responding police officers. How was this man able to get a license for 6 firearms in Australia, which has some of the toughest gun control laws in the world? How was he and his son able to travel to the Philippines to spend most of the month of November preparing for this attack? Why did the Australian police ignore warnings from the Mossad about the possibility of an attack on the Jewish community during the Hanukkah holiday? These and many more questions are sure to haunt many people in Israel, Australia, and beyond for many years to come. Answers won't come so easy, though, because Sajid Akram also died in an exchange of fire with police officers, and Nabid was seriously wounded after being initially disarmed by Ahmed Al-Ahmad, a vegetable salesman who immigrated to Australia from Syria in 2005 and was passing by when the shooting started. He courageously charged Nabid and managed to get his rifle away from him, but he himself suffered 5 hits to his arm and shoulder and hand, and is among the wounded who are still recovering in the hospital. So please join me in praying for his full recovery and his safety going forward, as there might be people who want to harm him and his family because of what he did to stop this horrible attack. I hate to say that last part, but the fact is, there were people who came to the memorial service that was held at Bondi Beach the very next day to shout anti-Israel slogans and otherwise harass the mourners who were gathered there. That is the reality of life in Australia and many other places all over the Western world. In 2025, it's a different world we live in. Ordinary human decency, common sense, and even sanity are not so common anymore, and this is becoming more evident with every passing day. Now, I'm not trying to preach a sermon here, but in this context, it's good to review 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. This is what it says. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And from such people turn away. Friends, to switch briefly to commentary mode, it is no secret to anyone that the atmosphere in the world is getting darker and darker, and has been the case all throughout human history. Jews are serving as the canary in the coal mine. The lack of compassion and decency shown towards the victims of this terror attack, which was also a hate crime, is an indication of the broader shift in the culture. I do not expect things to turn around or improve. And I note that since the ceasefire came into effect in Gaza, it seems like the anger towards Israel all over the world has only gotten more intense. I know many people said that when the fighting in Gaza stopped, the tension would shift elsewhere and the pressure on Israel would lessen, but that has not happened. I think we should expect for things to just keep getting more intense going forward. It's the birth pangs of the end times, especially since there is a very real possibility of renewed fighting in Gaza and also in Lebanon. So we'll switch back to news mode now and take a closer look at these two fronts. Last Friday evening, the IDF struck a vehicle in Gaza City carrying Raed Saad, Hamas's second-in-command in the Gaza Strip, and some of his senior deputies. Now, these guys have been hiding in tunnels for months, but recently began to emerge and move around in the open. You can run, but you cannot hide. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the strike was in retaliation for an incident earlier in the day in which the detonation of an improvised explosive device wounded 2 IDF soldiers on the outskirts of Khan Yunis. But other sources in the security echelon seem to indicate that the strike was part of a larger strategic plan, and so the wounding of the soldiers was probably just a pretext. In any case, this incident illustrates some of the difficulties Israel is facing in the Gaza Strip, as Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement is essentially over. But Phase 2 has not even begun yet and might never even begin. That's because Hamas still hasn't handed over the remains of Ra'an Geveli, an IDF soldier who fell in battle on October 7, 2023, and his body was kidnapped back into Gaza. He is the very last hostage, alive or dead, remaining in Gaza. And Israel is saying that we just can't move to Phase 2 of the ceasefire until his remains are turned over. However, Phase 2 of the ceasefire plan is supposed to include Hamas disarming and an international stabilization force deploying in the Strip to enforce the setting up of a technocratic government to replace the Hamas administration. Well, Hamas officials won't have anything to do with it. They say they're not going to cooperate with this part of the deal that they had previously agreed to. The mediators, primarily Turkey and Qatar, which were instrumental in getting Hamas to agree to the deal originally, are not pressing them now. But Turkey is trying to get itself added to the stabilization force, despite Israel saying this is not acceptable. As the old saying goes, something has to give, and my personal opinion is that in the end, Israel will be forced into agreeing to Turkish forces being sent into the Strip. I don't believe those forces will have orders to confront Hamas. Rather, they are likely to have orders to assist Hamas any way they can. But while the IDF will have no choice but to redeploy further east as part of Phase 2 of the plan, Washington is also demanding that Israel pay for the clearing of rubble from the Strip, starting in Rafah. In short, things don't look good for Israel and Gaza. Well, there is also trouble on the northern border, as Hezbollah is also refusing to disarm, as the ceasefire agreement they made with Israel calls on them to do so. The United States, France, and several moderate Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are trying to demand that the internationally recognized government in Beirut do its part to disarm and dismantle Hezbollah. But there's really only so much these governments can do. The internationally recognized government of Lebanon and the Lebanese National Army are fragile. They're weak, and whether they want to carry out their part in the plan to disarm Hezbollah or not, they simply don't have the ability to do so. To their credit, they have done some important work in southern Lebanon over the past year, clearing unexploded ordnance from the battlefields, demolishing several Hezbollah bunkers and arms depots, and otherwise cleaning the area up. But the sad reality is that Hezbollah has far more money, equipment, and trained personnel than the Lebanese National Army. Hezbollah also pays its fighters more than 3 times the monthly salary that an LNA trooper earns, and it's likely that Hezbollah is also paying quite a large number of LNA troops and other government employees to spy on the army and those organizations they work for. In short, the LNA is completely outmatched by Hezbollah and unable to stop them from rearming and preparing for another round of hostilities with Israel. I have no doubt that there are many brave men and women in the Lebanese government and army who are doing their best because no one wants another war. In fact, I'm sure even many in Hezbollah are tired of all this and don't want another war with Israel either. But they're not the ones making the decisions. That's being done in Tehran. Is anybody still in Tehran, where the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is still furious over the humiliating defeat they suffered in the 12-day war in June? They want another war because they think that next time they'll beat Israel and be vindicated. That's why they're pushing Hezbollah to rearm and prepare for another round, and they're also spending all their money and effort on building new ballistic missiles, drones, and other weapons to fire at Israel. They believe their own fairy tales about how they really hit Israel hard in the 12-day war, and they only stopped because the U.S. got involved. If Donald Trump hadn't imposed a ceasefire on both sides, the Iranians could have finished Israel off for good. That's not true, but that's what they're telling themselves and everyone else. So now they have to try and turn their fairy tales, their fables, into reality by waging another war against Israel, which this time they think they'll win. They are also, to go back to the story earlier about the attack in Sydney, sponsoring terror squads to hit Jewish and Israeli targets all over the world. It's not unlikely that these squads of Iranian-backed spies are also targeting pro-Israel Christian churches. So be careful out there. Get security. Be careful. Of course, back in Iran, literally everything is falling apart. The country is experiencing a crippling drought, which I've told you about. The air quality in the cities is catastrophically bad. They're running out of pharmaceuticals, baby formula, and all kinds of other stuff. The Iranian currency, the rial, is trading at 1.3 million to the US dollar, meaning it's basically useless. And Iranians are better off using their banknotes as toilet paper with the Ayatollah's face on it, than to try and use them to buy actual toilet paper. That sounds like a joke, but it's literally true, and it's only one of the many grim realities ordinary Iranians are facing these days. But the regime doesn't care about its people any more than it cares about the people of Lebanon. It is obsessed with a demonically inspired hatred of Israel, which is prompting continued preparations for war. Therefore, here in Israel, we have no choice but to also prepare for war. And that's exactly what we're doing here at Vision for Israel, and doing our part by continuing to place bomb safety shelters in communities all over the country. We're also providing life-saving equipment to medical first responders, firefighting teams, and even the police. So please watch this short video which shows how you can be part of this program. Amen. After October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews. Since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war. And the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. In the second half of this week's report, we need to go over some stuff that doesn't always make big headlines, but it does affect the lives of every single person in Israel. So to start off with, we need to talk about the economy, and then we'll move on to the weather. In last week's report, I told you that the government has all but finalized the budget for 2026, which includes large increases for defense and security, cuts in almost every other department, and tax increases. Inflation is also an issue in Israel, as it is in many other countries, and prices for pretty much everything that people need in their day-to-day lives, to say nothing of luxury items, are only going in one direction, and that's straight up. All of this adds up to a substantial increase in the cost of living for ordinary Israelis. And this week, senior economists published numbers that bring this issue into sharper focus. According to this report, starting on January 1st of 2026, the average Israeli household will need to spend between 800 and 1,200 shekels a month more than what they were used to spending. That's around $250 to $375, which might not sound like much, but in a country where the average monthly salary is only $4,350 a month and many households aren't even earning that much, these extra expenses add up fast. As a matter of fact, if you do the math, that means that an average household will spend between $3,000 to $4,500 more in 2026 than they did in 2025, which is basically an entire extra month salary. So where will all this extra expense come from? The report says that the prices of many basic household items is set to increase in January 1st. This includes water, which is set for a nationwide price increase of 2.49%. Electricity is set to increase in price by 1.5%, cooking gas by 5%, and at the grocery store, pretty much everything is set to be more expensive going forward. I probably don't have to explain what that's like to you, because this is happening almost everywhere these days. Other increased expenses that Israeli households are likely to feel in 2026 include sharp rises in municipal property taxes, which anyone who lives in a house or apartment or operates a business pays, and it's assessed according to the square meters in that structure. In some cities, this tax is set to increase by as much as, 17%! And I'm frankly astounded that this is even being allowed to happen. Now, I don't know how anyone is going to be able to afford to live in some of these places with that kind of tax burden. Speaking of which, the tax brackets and credits are also being frozen instead of being adjusted for inflation. This means cuts to the real wages and take-home pay that millions of Israelis will receive every month going forward is in trouble. Other taxes are also being either increased or not decreased as was planned to happen. And last but certainly not least, the wages of public sector employees will also be cut. This last part is especially hard since many public employees, especially teachers, already make very low wages compared to the private sector. Now, there's another big factor in all of this, and that is the fluctuation in Israel's civilian population. According to some estimates, nearly 130,000 Israelis left the country over the past 2 years of this war. Where are they going? A large percentage of these moves were temporary, and those people will move back sooner or later. In addition, we're expecting a large number of new immigrants to arrive in the next few years as the security situation for Jewish people around the world continues to deteriorate. Absorbing all these newcomers is going to cost a lot of money, and it's also going to generate a lot of economic activity here in Israel, but that'll take a while. I know that's how it works because I was here in the 1990s during the large influx of new immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and I saw it all happen with my own eyes. It included a boom in construction of new housing, new schools for the much larger number of children who needed them, new businesses for the large number of people who needed jobs, and everything else you can imagine. For a few years, until all that new stuff got built, there were shortages of pretty much everything, and that was difficult to deal with as well. There was also lots of strains put on social cohesion as the Russian-speaking Jews brought with them all kinds of cultural habits and attitudes that were not normative in Israel before then. That adjustment is still ongoing, by the way. And with this new wave of immigrants that's coming, everyone is going to have to make a lot more adjustments. All of this is going to cost money. And as I said before, in the previous segment, the cost of living in Israel, the state budget, and the general rise in inflation that Israelis are feeling along with everyone else is already putting a deep strain on everyone. That's why, once again, here at Vision for Israel, we're proudly working day and night to find ways to support Israeli families, new olim under stress, and that includes almost everyone these days. We're providing direct assistance, counseling, care, and support for thousands of families, while also trying to prepare for problems that we can see coming down the road. So please watch this short video, and don't forget to go to our website, visionforisrael.com, about how you can be part of blessing Israelis in this very challenging time. Welcome back, friends. Now we're coming near to the end of this week's report, so I'm just going to quickly run through some of the other big stories making headlines in Israel this week, starting with a subject that everyone complains about but no one ever does anything about, and that's the weather. Last week, Storm Byron hit Israel after clobbering our neighbors in Greece and Cyprus. Now, I've lived in Israel for more than 45 years, and I can't remember many named storms, so this one was certainly memorable, although I'm not sure Byron is a name I would have picked. Why not my Hebrew name, Baruch? In any case, it dumped enormous amounts of rain on the northern coastal plain and significant volumes on other areas, including the Galilee, which increased the level of the Sea of Galilee by several centimeters. That's vitally important for everyone in this country, and it's also important for our neighbors. Further south, there was flooding in Ashdod and Ashkelon, and several roads were also impassable in the Negev for several hours at a time. Several stranded drivers needed to be rescued, and there was also a few people who needed to be rescued from flooded homes and various places. And there were 2 reports of storm-related fatalities as well as several injuries. The rain mostly stopped everywhere by Saturday evening, but then more rain began to fall on Monday morning in several areas, and scattered showers were forecast in various places, including Jerusalem, for the rest of the week. Once again, this large volume of precipitation coming in such a short period of time, instead of being spread out over several weeks as usually it is done, caused mild flooding in some places. But for the most part, Israel's infrastructure was able to handle it. Now, this was not the case in many of our neighbors, including far to the west in Morocco, where the coastal city of Safi was hit by severe flooding on Monday, which caused dozens of fatalities and many more injuries, along with massive property damage. This is of interest to us here in Israel because until 1948, there was a large and thriving Jewish community in Morocco, and even today there are many cultural and economic ties between our two countries. We also pay attention to what's happening in other regional neighbors and staying on the subject of whether these countries are going through a somewhat rough time. Now, the World Meteorological Organization issued a report this week showing that the Middle East and North Africa experienced its hottest year on record in 2024. As well as dozens of extreme weather events, which caused hundreds of fatalities and billions of dollars worth of property damage. WMO Secretary General Celeste Saulo presented the report declaring that in the Middle East and North Africa, quote, temperatures are rising at twice the global average. Droughts are becoming more frequent and severe in one of the world's most water-stressed regions, and at the same time we have seen some disruptive and dangerous floods, unquote. Friends, here in Israel, we are not immune from these trends, but the government and private sector have invested in solutions. Israel leads the world in water-related technologies, including desalination and water recycling. But there's only so much that technology can do to solve these problems. And in the end, we have to rely on God for real solutions. I urge you to join me in praying for Israel because the heat is on. The heat is on, da-da-da-da-da. It's only getting hotter. And even if we have enough water here, if our neighbors don't have enough, that's going to cause problems for us one way or the other. One way or the other. Well, I'm really singing today. I wish I could say I believe the government is aware of this and making plans to manage these issues, but I actually don't believe that to be the case. Now moving on, the FBI announced on Monday that it had broken up a plot by a pro-Palestinian group in Los Angeles to carry out a major terrorist attack on at least 5 sites in the city at midnight on New Year's Eve. Folks, I'm telling you, the world is losing its mind, and we all need to be in prayer and keep our ears and our eyes open and be sober and be vigilant, both physical and spiritual, open at all time. Now, I'd like to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news. So here it is. India's Minister of Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, visited Israel this past week, and I hope I pronounced your name right. In another sign of growing economic relationship between the two countries, Israel still has a few friends in the world, and that's great news. With that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. Spread the news, my friends.